All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I was thinking today we need maybe some intro music, maybe a live band for the beginning of our evening lectures. So welcome to Schoodic Institute in Acadia National Park and the penultimate edition of our Schoodic Summer Evening Lecture Series. I'm Nick Fisicelli with Schoodic, really happy to be able to welcome you all. And a big thank you to our corporate sponsor of our summer lecture series, Bar Harbor Bank and Trust. Thanks to them, we are able to bring this for our community, both here in person and folks who are on Zoom, joining us from all over the US. And I think tonight we even have Canada and the UK joining. So wanted to start off, it's the August edition of our lecture. It's that sort of transition time here where we're seeing signs of change happening. Temperatures in the 40s the last 2 mornings are definitely an indicator of some of that change. I see heads shaking in the audience here, not ready for this change to happen. But you know, the neotropical migrant warblers, they know what's happening. They're already starting to move. Angie is counting hawks up on Cadillac Mountain. They're also headed south. Big V's of cormorants are also moving south past Schoodic Point. So definitely some signs of change. Another sign of change for us is that we've been bidding farewell to some of our early career staff, and specifically our college interns that come and work with us for 8 or 10 weeks during the summer. So these are college students who have to do an internship as part of their degree programs. And this summer we had a couple of interns from University of Richmond, and it's always always exciting to be able to be with them during their time here, and at this time in their lives when they're in college and they're broadening their horizons super rapidly and figuring out really what they want to be in the world. And they're also being exposed to a lot of information. And unfortunately, a lot of doom and gloom about the world and the future and the world that they will be inheriting from us. And sometimes it's hard to maintain perspective and optimism when you get really hammered with so much doom and gloom. And I just want to share a little bit from one of our web stories, our e-news stories, that Izzy Andrus, who was one of our summer interns from University of Richmond, wrote. And you can find the full story online at schoodicinstitute.org. At the end of the piece that she wrote, it was about her summer experience here. She said, "Currently, humanity is creating many challenges for nature to overcome. These obstacles appear to be growing much larger, and I have often fallen into feelings of hopelessness when contemplating the future of our planet. Nevertheless, after seeing such hardworking efforts from everyone here at Schoodic Institute, I can't help but feel hopeful. This experience has not only taught me more about the natural world around me, but reaffirmed my devotion to helping conserve it. Much like the sunrise on Cadillac Mountain, Schoodic Institute scientists and everyone working to protect Acadia National Park have shone brilliantly, providing a much needed light in times of darkness." Yeah, I love that. And, you know, and this is what you all are supporting, that next generation who are going to face the challenges of the day and to move forward with the solutions. And I think perhaps Izzy is a climate musk ox, but I'm going to let our speaker tonight share more on just what in the world a climate musk ox is. And I'm super excited for tonight's speaker, an amazing scientist who is also an amazing science communicator. And those two really need to go together in order to advance the science and solutions and engagement that's needed in the response to rapid change. And so I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Jacquelyn Gill. She is an internationally recognized paleoecologist and multiple award-winning science communicator. She's a professor of paleoecology and the director of the BEAST Lab at the University of Maine. She will have to explain the acronym BEAST to us. In addition to her passion for research and teaching, Dr. Gill is also dedicated to sharing science with the public. She was the co-creator of one of the first climate podcasts called Warm Regards, and as well as the forthcoming show, Jax and Phoebe Make a Planet. So please join me in welcoming Jacquelyn.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for that invitation, and also for all of you for coming out. A really beautiful night when you had many options in terms of how you spend your time. So I'm honored that you decided to spend it here. And for those of you who are wondering, BEAST stands for Biodiversity and Environments Across Space and Time. So as a paleoecologist, I tend to think big. I think on large time scales, large spatial scales, but even though I spend much of my time up here in the last ice age, my heart is very much rooted in the challenges of the present and the coming future. And so I want to share a little bit of what I have learned as both a scientist and especially a science communicator, and how that has informed my thinking and also my own resilience in doing work in a world where, you know, you might have seen there's an image with a dinosaur that says, "All my friends are dead," right? So as somebody who researches woolly mammoths and other extinct species, I feel this deeply, right? My study system is long gone. So I understand the risks of extinction. You know, my research takes me to some of the worst moments in Earth's history. And it can be humbling and also inspiring because there are stories of resilience as well as death and despair. And I think we need to hold on to lots of complicated ideas as we move into the future, which means recognizing the challenges of the Anthropocene, but maybe carrying some of the resilience of the Pleistocene with us so that we can show up and do the work that is needed. So, and that's where musk ox come in. So again, like this is not a new graph for you, probably for most of you, but like many people who do this work, I am deeply motivated, not just by understanding and reconstructing the past, but by thinking about what's coming by the end of this century. And I should say that one of the really powerful things that I will hopefully share with you today is that which of these futures we are following, which of these pathways, if you imagine you're on a skateboard or a wheelchair or some sort of wheeled vehicle and you're hurtling up these cliffs, the steepness of that cliff is determined by the things that we are doing right now. And the actions that people have taken in the past has actually bent that future downwards. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that. So when I was coming up as a scientist and as a science communicator, I was taught that the thing that we needed to communicate to the public was this: climate change is real, it's bad, it's us, and the time to act is now. And increasingly in my science communication and also in the classroom, as more and more young people started to come through my doors, I started to realize people knew that already, especially college students and youth. They would come into the classroom and they'd kind of look at me like, yeah, I know, my whole life is like this. It's never been anything other than this, right? And increasingly over the last decade, climate change is not just something that we're thinking about that's coming in the future. It's not just something that we're concerned might happen. You just have to walk out your door on a rough day and you can breathe it in. You feel it in your bodies, right? I have an autoimmune disease. On a bad air quality day, I feel climate change, right? And the way in which the discourse about climate in this country is so dysfunctional, and the history of that discourse has led a lot of people to believe that it's very binary. right? You either acknowledge that this is happening or you're pretending that it's not, right? But in reality, there are not two Americas when it comes to climate beliefs. There are six. You might have seen this graph before. We can actually and this slide is already out of date because these surveys that the Yale Program on Climate Communication does happen multiple times a year. You can get county level information. So if you're from Maine, you can find your county in Maine. If you're from somewhere else in the United States, you can look up how your neighbors feel, what their beliefs are about climate change. And one of the things that's really powerful about this work is that not just that we can see that climate belief is a little bit more complex than maybe we often think it might be, especially the way it's portrayed in the media, but the fact that belief in climate change is a serious problem has increased over time. While the group of very loud and often organized dismissives, right, the people who disbelieve climate change vocally, has not gone anywhere, right? It's maybe declined at times to single digits, but kind of hovers around 10%. We hear from those people a lot more, right? But most of your neighbors are not going to be in that group in most parts of the country. And so you can see that over half of the country takes climate change seriously as a problem. So whether they are alarmed or concerned, right? Or maybe cautious, they're just starting to think of it as something that might be happening to them maybe in the future. And then you have the disengaged. Those are people for whom other problems might be more near or acute. They're the doubtful folks. Again, they're kind of hovering around 10%, maybe some slight declines. But the dismissives are a small percentage of the population, which means we have a tremendous community of people that we can leverage for climate action. And increasingly, when I go out into the world and I talk about climate change, what I hear from those people is not, is this happening? Is it true that it's us? What they want to know is, what can I do, right? And so that means that as educators, as scientists and science communicators, as writers, as neighbors, we need to be talking about what's possible in terms of climate action. We need to be road mapping solutions for people. And yet many of us are kind of still stuck in that model of thinking, oh no, my job is to convince people climate change is real. Most of the country is actually here with us already. They get it. So denial is not the problem anymore. And we are lagging behind in terms of shifting the narrative away from convincing the deniers. You will not move these people. There is no moving them. You are wasting your time trying to convince your denier, uncle or neighbor or coworker. You need to be focusing on the people who understand the scope of the problem, who agree that it's real, and who might need a little bit of encouragement to take some steps, to take some actions, not just individually, that can be important, but as part of groups, which we'll get to. However, as the climate crisis continues to unfold and action is not matching the scale of the problem, we are seeing a rise, understandably, in bad feelings, right? Bad feelings about our planet, bad feelings about our future, bad feelings about our climate. And when polled, about 7% of Americans are feeling climate-related psychological stress. Okay, that doesn't sound very much. But if you look worldwide, that number is closer, at people 16 to 25, so youth globally, that number is closer to 84%. 84% of the world's youth feel climate-related psychological stress, climate depression, climate anxiety. So those of you who are in mental health professions, those of you who are in faith communities or other communities where you have opportunities to, again, reach this problem where it's at, this is an avenue that we need more people working in. And so as I've gone out in the world and talked about climate change, a really funny thing happened around 2018. I stopped getting bullied by climate deniers, and I started getting yelled at by people who were telling me that it was too late and that I was morally irresponsible for talking about climate action because the world was over and that the only thing that we could do was hunker down, hold our loved ones close, and hope for a kind ending. And that, let me tell you, scared me so much more than the denial ever did. And so I really started to want to trace the evolution of this problem. I wanted to understand where these feelings were coming from, not just, in terms of understanding, well, yes, of course, you're going to have bad feelings about climate change if we have a problem and we have an action on that problem. But I wanted to go back and really, because I'm a paleoecologist, I look to the past for answers, right? So I wanted to walk us through the climate conversation in this country, because I think it helps to ground the discussion of these feelings of defeatism, which just as a side note, I'm increasingly using the word defeatism instead of doomism. Doomism is very popular, but as people tell me, doom is a normal thing to feel in the world right now. That's a natural human emotion. So using the term doomism feels like it's belittling, like, no, you shouldn't feel doom. It's all going to be okay. And defeatism instead is the feeling that we have lost and there's nothing that we can do about it. And that's a different kind of emotion. So some of you who have been involved in environmental issues for a long time or have read about these issues in your own work or just for fun, you might know that the scientific community in the United States has been formally raising concerns about climate change to the federal government since 1965, right? There's been discussions in various news articles and other places for longer than that. We've known about the risks that greenhouse gases play in terms of warming our planet for much longer. But in terms of a formal communication by the scientific community to the federal government, it starts with this report on restoring the quality of our environment. And that 1965 report states very unequivocally, if we do not stop with greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to warm the planet, and that is going to have negative, detrimental consequences. So just to ground you a little bit for transparency in this timeline, I was born in 1980 when CO2 levels were 339 parts per million. So when I'm about 7 years old, the United Nations, in growing recognition that this is a problem, launched the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So these IPCC reports that come out every 7 years or so, that started in 1988 when I'm still in elementary school. In 1997, so a decade later, there was an international treaty that extended the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that basically committed state parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And up until this point, the United States government, Congress specifically, was on board with the idea that climate change was a problem and we needed to do something with it. So 1988, even by then, we were starting to acknowledge that this is a bipartisan issue, right? For those of you who need some extra convincing, it was a Republican president who passed the Clean Air Act and started the EPA, right? And so the environment has not always been a partisan issue. But by this point, in 1997, the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty, and this represented a fundamental shift. And that shift, where climate change becomes partisan, was the direct result of the efforts of the fossil fuel industry to spread misinformation about climate change. And for those of you who want to know more about this, I definitely recommend checking out the book by Naomi Oreskes, which I'm suddenly blanking on. Merchants of Doubt, thank you. Which goes into detail about how the same consulting firms and sometimes the same individuals who spread doubt about cigarettes and tobacco's link to smoking were hired by the fossil fuel industry to spread doubt about man-made climate change, right? Anthropogenic climate change. So this is a concerted effort, and we start to see that effort bearing fruit by 1997. Another decade or so goes by, and 2 movies come out. We have 2004's The Day After Tomorrow, which was hugely formative for me. I was just about to graduate college, and that movie comes out. A movie with a hero who's a paleoclimatologist. I mean, that's a pretty rare thing. And here I am now. And in 2006, Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, comes out. Okay, by a show of hands, just out of curiosity, Which of these two movies do you think had a larger role in shifting public opinion on climate change? In other words, was it The Day After Tomorrow or An Inconvenient Truth that got more people to shift their belief to climate change is a problem and we need to do something about it? Raise your hand if you think it's the science fiction blockbuster The Day After Tomorrow. Raise your hand if you think it is the documentary An Inconvenient Truth. All right, fortunately, we have data, again, by the Yale Yale Project on Climate Communication. It is The Day After Tomorrow. Despite it being, obviously science fiction, very exaggerated in terms of these, polar storms basically become the villain, the supervillain of the movie. That film does more to shift public perceptions on climate change than the documentary does. And the takeaway there is that stories matter and will overpower facts every time, right? Narrative is important. So those of you who work in creative fields, your work is hugely powerful in terms of shifting the needle about public perceptions and belief, because we latch on to stories. We are a storytelling species. And so again, these movies come out, we start to see public perceptions on climate change shifting, right? And then it just becomes in your face at this point, right? The decades of the 2010s, we start to see global heat records smashed every single year, over and over and over again. From 2009 to 2019, we see the 10 hottest years on record. Some of the 10 hottest years on record globally are kind of happening within that decade. Of course, if we were to update this now, we would see even more records broken. And so at a certain point, when every year becomes the hottest year, and that just keeps happening, it becomes harder and harder for some people to ignore. And it becomes clear that climate change is not just a future problem, it is a here and now problem, especially as we start to see the impacts of those changes. And then 2018 happens. And I think of 2018 as a watershed moment. I'm not a historian, except of the planet, but I really do think this is a tipping point in terms of the public discourse and communication. And several things happen in 2018, which is sort of towards the end of that very hot decade. The first thing that happens is Jem Bendel comes out with a white paper called A Deep Adaptation, a map for navigating climate tragedy. And in this white paper, it's called a white paper because it's not published in the peer-reviewed literature, so he just puts it out there. He states that mitigation is not enough to stave off collapse. That's the word he uses, collapse, even with total decarbonization and aggressive solar geoengineering. In other words, if we sci-fi our way through this problem, we still cannot avoid an imminent societal collapse. It's coming within our lifetimes, and we need to prepare. This is widely criticized within the scientific community for being somewhat unscientific, for portraying an uncertain future as certain. And also, it's criticized by a lot of social justice communities because it completely ignores the fact that the impacts of climate change are not felt equally on this planet, that frontline communities have been dealing with these impacts for years or decades already, right? And have not just given up and gone to their bunkers and started collecting seeds, right? They are still out there fighting. And so a lot of people loved this paper. A lot of people hated this paper. It was incredibly controversial. But you start to see bubbling up out of this emphasis, this interest, this focus on collapse, right? Societal collapse. By that fall, we see Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future protests. There's an unprecedented, completely unpredicted youth climate movement that just explodes onto the international stage, and that becomes incredibly powerful. And so you start to see this, gaining national attention in the press, and Greta becomes a figurehead for this youth movement. And then later that fall, the United Nations has a subgroup that comes out with a report that warns that we have 12 years to limit climate change from being completely catastrophic. And they're specifically talking about the 1.5 degrees target. This gets really complicated because I put a lot of weight on this specific Guardian article. You might have read it at the time, because it oversimplifies the science on what the 1.5 degrees target actually was and what it was trying to accomplish. And for a little bit of context here, I'm going to get a tiny bit nerdy. 1.5 degrees, for any of you who are not familiar, was decided based on the needs of island nations who were facing flooding as a result of the sort of lower end projection of warming. And when the climate community came together and looked at how to forestall warming beyond 1.5 degrees, it was determined that we would essentially have to cut our emissions roughly in half over the next 10 years. So this is, again, starting in 2018, and then all the way to net zero by the end of 20 years. And most of the energy system models that were tasked to create 1.5 degrees warming scenarios basically returned results that said, this is impossible. It cannot be done. The timeline is too short. The warming is too small, or is too limited. We've already warmed about 1.1 degrees at this point. And so the only way they could make it work is to have a more gradual decline in emissions, reaching net zero by about 2050, so in about 30 years instead of 20. And then we'll just make up for that by sucking an immense amount of carbon out of the atmosphere later on in the century. We'll just kind of arm wave our way through this problem. And the only way to make that work, according to the models, was to devote about 2 to 3 times the land area of India to decarbonization. Right? That's an immense amount of land. So the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere every year to meet these targets. And again, that's with overshoot. We're overshooting our goal and then kind of pulling it back. And the problem with having a target where you can only warm about 0.3 degrees more, 0.4 degrees more than we already are, you either have to get your emissions very low, very fast, or you have to overshoot and correct. And that is the brutal math of 1.5 degrees. The reason that I'm saying this, I'm knocking you down so we can lift you back up later. The reason that I'm saying this, 1.5 was always a stretch. That's being generous. It was, most of the scientific community has felt like it was always an impossible goal. But it was a capitulation to island communities. It was an acknowledgement that 1.5 degrees is going to be brutally awful for low-lying nations, island nations, that are at risk of flooding. But we're not going to make it. And the scientific community didn't want to say that. We didn't want to go out into the world and say, yeah, so this target that we've said that we are definitely working towards is not only impossible, but we're almost certainly not going to achieve it. And yet the broader community, especially when you have reporting like this, starts to treat this as a ticking clock, right? We are ticking down to a catastrophe. 1.5 degrees becomes framed as game over for the entire planet. This is a binary pass-fail system. And so you start to see things like this, right? Clocks in the street. You're walking down towards your oblivion, you're walking down the street, you look up, and that's how many years you have until oblivion. This is about when I start getting emails from youth asking me if they will be able to grow up, if they should go to college, if they might have kids someday, right? And Gan Golan, Andrew Boyd, and others take this and they say, the Earth has a deadline. This is a line. When we cross it, it's done. Well, of course, people are going to see this and take away the message that we are doomed and that there is nothing that we can do, because people understand. They can look around. They see that we're not changing our lifestyles and our emissions, and corporations are not voluntarily reducing emissions fast enough. Billionaires are getting richer. They're not, stopping being billionaires. We are going to blow past 1.5 degrees. And in a 2019 study, just 1 year later, by Jen Marlin and others, again at the Yale Program on Climate Communication, 17% of the interviewees that they talked to that year lacked hope. They completely lacked hope. So nearly a fifth of their interviewees. And so now we see the rise of what has been termed doomism. I like to think of it as defeatism. Just that it's the idea that we have lost, not are losing, but have lost the climate battle. So we feel nothing but helplessness and anxiety about that. What else is there to feel, right? We've lost, it's done. We have a few years left and that's it. The problem is that doomism, despair, defeatism, whatever you want to call it, can be just as harmful as blind optimism, because they all rely on a sense of certainty about an uncertain future. And with that certainty, we give ourselves permission not to act. There's a wonderful quote by Margaret Atwood from the book Oryx and Crake, where she says, when people believe nothing can be done, they do worse than nothing. Right? Let that sit for a second. Like, think about, yes, these are natural emotional responses, but we have not abrogated our responsibility to the world, right? To future generations. And there's a wonderful scientific article by Lamb and others from 2020 called The Discourses of Climate Delay, where they lay this out really clearly. And they say that the idea that change is possible or that there are only certain perfect solutions and we'll never quite make it, those are just as harmful as denial because the outcome is the same. If the outcome is we don't act on climate, then they are just as bad, even though they're coming from a place of love and care and grief for the planet and not just denial. And so if there is only one thing that you take away from this talk tonight, I hope that it is that the climate crisis is not pass-fail. 1.5 degrees was always a flawed target. It was extremely optimistic, but it is not game over when we pass it. And that is because every fraction of a degree represents millions of lives, natural, human, right? And that means that every fraction of a degree matters, and this will always be true, as long as you are alive, as long as you are breathing, and as long as your descendants are breathing, right? We can still bend that future. There has been loss, which means that this pass-fail model is already broken. There was never a no-harm scenario possible. Harm has already happened. People have died because of climate change, right? But we can prevent more death in the future, and that will always be true. And so there are those in the scientific community or in the activism community or writers and others who lean into this idea of climate doom, right? Wanting to shake people up, right? They wanted to shake them into action by focusing on the scale of the problem and on how bad it is. The problem with this is that there's a really good and robust research community out there who studies how we think and why we feel things and how we make decisions. And we know from them that fear appealing to our fear of the future, doesn't actually work very well. It tends to freeze us. It tends to make us give up. And so, for example, do you know what caused people to stop smoking? Any guesses? Taxes. We have taxes over here, so money, that plays a role. Making multiple appeals. I don't know if any of you ever grew up, like when I went to school, there were pictures of what your face would look like or what your lungs would look like, right? So talking about smoking's impacts on things like cancer did not work. What caused smoking to decline was a public program to get people to think that smoking was not cool anymore, right? So you change the social landscape. And with climate change, that means taking away the social license that the fossil fuel industry has to operate. Overconsumption is not cool. Burning fossil fuels is not cool. Being a billionaire, not cool, right? Like, we know what works and what doesn't work. And there's a lot of interest in how emotional responses translate to action or don't. People are actively researching this right now, right? And so if you are interested in climate solutions and you feel like maybe you want to contribute to this problem, but you're not sure that you want to work with climate models, but you like working with people, we need more people doing this work, right? Climate psychology and climate social sciences. There are studies that show how different degrees of hope or doubt will actually affect climate change mobilization, how reading a book that's a fictional depiction of a climate future, how much that affects climate action for a year after you read that book, right? So people are studying these things. Everything that I'm saying right now in this talk is, to some extent, a testable hypothesis about how to get people to change their behavior. And in many cases, those hypotheses have already been tested. And so as a scientist, I turn to that literature, right? I turn to those experts to shape my own engagement with communities on climate change. There's this great paper, again, by my colleague Jen Marlin, where they look at hope and despair or doubt, and they found that constructive hope and doubt predict increased policy support and political engagement, but false hope, the idea that, oh, someone will fix it for us, we'll technologically save ourselves in the future someday, someone will do it, it'll be great. Or fatalistic doubt, we're doomed, right? Predict the opposite. An interaction exists between constructive hope and doubt in predicting political behavioral intentions, which suggests that having hope that humans will reduce climate change, along with the recognition that we're not doing enough, may also be constructive and motivate political action. So believing that our actions matter does not make you a bad climate activist. And it doesn't mean that you have to abandon your understanding of the full weight of the climate crisis. So I loved that quote that Nick started off with in the introduction, right? The sense of despair that the student came into this experience with was then tempered by the hope that they felt by acting around others who were working on the problem. That can be really powerful. So that's where this is where I sort of move into okay, well, that's all nice, right? But what are we actually going to do about it? I'm sure that's why many of you came here. And so for those of you who have been paying attention to this climate conversation for a long time, this is a little bit of an outdated reference, but for many years, before it became kind of unavoidable that the action, climate change impacts were already with us, people would talk about climate hawks and climate doves, right? The climate hawks were arguing for the aggressive action, immediate action, extreme action on climate change. And the climate doves would say, oh, that's a future problem. We have more time. Maybe technology will work itself out. We don't need to act as aggressively or as quickly. So we're going to throw this metaphor away. And I'm going to ask you instead to be a climate musk ox. No offense to the birders in the room, but we're gonna move into the mammals. And there are some really good reasons for this. This is not just an arbitrary selection. Musk ox have come to mean quite a lot to me in my research for what they symbolize as a species. And the first one is that they are resilient. They, unlike most of their cousins, their large mammal cousins, did not go extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about woolly mammoths and beavers the size of black bears and lots of really wonderful and incredible creatures, armadillos the size of a VW bus, right? An amazing world that we were so close to and just missed. And muskox are part of that world, and they are still with us. They live in some of the harshest places on the planet. They turn and face into the storm, right? And that to me is just a symbol of the need to cultivate that resilience in ourselves. And that means that we can't just talk about the problem. We also have to talk about solutions. We desperately need positive stories on climate change, not just to make us happy or to placate us that everything is going to be okay, but by focusing on what works, we know what to do more of. We're teaching each other how to get through this. And this idea that if it bleeds, it leads is a very uniquely American phenomenon. When I talk to journalists from other parts of the world, they tell me that the climate solutions journalism is alive and well in places like Costa Rica or South Africa or Denmark, right? They are focusing on what we need to do more of. It's only here in the United States and some of the other fossil fuel countries like the UK and Australia, where there's such an emphasis on the tragedy and the loss. And on the one hand, Thank you, journalism, for finally telling the truth about climate change. I greatly appreciate it. You are on board. It felt like for a very long time, no one was listening. But also, it's not okay to go from silence to defeat and to just blow past the part where we do something about the problem. And we can't do something if we don't know what works. So we can't just focus on what's not working. So here's a positive story for you. Thanks to work by volunteers, scientists, industry, policymakers, the worst case climate scenarios that I started off by showing you are now off the table. The amount of warming that was predicted by the end of this century when I was in graduate school or when I started my faculty job at the University of Maine was hotter. That was a hotter future than we're looking at right now. I can see on your faces that you do not believe me, but I'm telling you it's true. And this is because of several things, including a faster than predicted growth in clean energy, right? Which despite federal policy, the market's not going in that direction, right? Globally. And especially if you look at China, right? Where they're now leading in clean energy production and innovation. And also a faster than predicted decline in coal. The coal industry collapsed faster than people thought it would. The other thing that has shaped this is an unpredictable climate youth movement that just burst onto the scene. And groups like Sunrise, which have partnered with labor movements and others, have made this a working people's problem. So it's not just this intellectual conversation, right? It affects everyday people in their everyday lives. So this RCP 8.5, you might have heard that climate scenario, is no longer on the table. It is not a likely scenario. The flip side is that 1.5 is also off the table, as I've told you. So we're going to be somewhere here in the middle, right? Somewhere between 2.5 and 3. Right now, 3 seems the likeliest. But that's better than 5 and it's better than 4. And we can still bend it down. I would have liked 1.5. That would have been nice. I would have liked 1.1, 1.2. But again, every degree, every fraction of a degree translates to millions of lives and species still being here at the end of the century that otherwise wouldn't. Here's another bit of positive news. Anybody remember that little hole in the ozone layer? Sometimes people bring this up and say, hey, whatever happened to that? You environmentalists made a whole big deal about that, and whatever happened to that? Well, what happened is that globally we came together and we did something about it. And what I love about this story, and I do not hear anyone ever talk about this, is that the hole in the ozone layer is not only a lesson in effective policy change, it is a climate win. So first of all, do yourself a favor, go read about how this happened. Go read about how there was this incredibly amazing partnership where it wasn't just international agreements, but to ratify those agreements here in the US. And also we were at the cusp of investing in a bunch of aircraft that would have produced even more ozone depleting chemicals. And then because of a grassroots campaign to communicate to Congress, Congress decided not to invest in that fleet of aircraft, in addition to banning CFCs. That was also led by industry, right? Major chemical companies, I believe Dow, read the room and said, or no, was it DuPont? Was it DuPont? I'm looking at you because, yeah, it was DuPont, read the room. Sorry, I've got a plant in the audience. DuPont read the room and voluntarily started phasing out its use of CFCs. And other companies saw that and they said, I don't know what they know that we don't, but we should do that if DuPont is doing it. So this can be, it doesn't have to just come from the grassroots. There can be leadership in industry as well. And so this combination, this really interesting combination of grassroots pressure, congressional and international regulations, and industry leadership phased out CFCs. And not only is the hole in the ozone layer about halfway towards healing, but had we not banned CFCs and ozone depleting chemicals, right now, today, it would be 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer, because subsequent studies found that CFCs are also powerful greenhouse gases. We didn't know that at the time. That's not why they were phased out. But had that not happened, had we continued with business as usual, it would be 1.5 degrees warmer now. That means we'd be looking down, we'd be looking at about 3 degrees warming at this point. So, you know, of the people who are hopeful in studies by folks like Jen Marlin and others, the most hopeful category reported that learning about climate wins and successful climate action gave them hope, but also motivated them to do more, to take more action. So telling positive stories does not placate people, it empowers them. So that's reason one to be a Musk Ox. Be resilient. Cultivate your resilience with positive stories of climate action. The other thing I love about Musk Ox is they are collective. They are a community. This picture, they did not like line up to pose for this. This is a formation that many hoofed animals do, where when they are threatened, they circle up, and the elephants do this as well. The young and the injured, the elderly, the sick are in the center, and the rest face outwards towards the danger, protecting the vulnerable inside the circle. And that means that we need to stop carrying the weight of climate change on our own shoulders. Of course, it feels like it is too big of a problem for any one person to solve, because it is. You can't do it. You cannot, you cannot, you cannot, you cannot, I cannot, right? Not by ourselves. So we have to abandon the individualism that helped get us here in the first place and start thinking like a community, start thinking like a herd of musk ox. And the thing that has worked the most, this is just some anecdata, but there is some science behind this. The thing that works the most to knock you out of your climate despair, and so I really, again, loved that anecdote that essay that Nick shared about the student who came to Schoodic and worked with other people and felt hope, is to find your climate community. There are people who need you. Everyone in this room. Are there any moms here? Yeah, Moms Clean Air Force. They are amazing. They need help. Are there any seniors here? You all look so young. It's amazing. I can't tell. Third Act and Seniors for Climate and 1,000 Grandmothers for Future Generations are wonderful organizations. Citizens Climate Lobby needs everyone. Anyone can help. Those of you who are involved in faith communities, Interfaith Power and Light does incredible work, right? The Climate Justice Alliance and Climate Disobedience Center and others. There is an organization for just about anything that you do or care about or are, right? You are invited to find that one group, that one herd, and join it. It might not be glamorous. They might just need you to lick envelopes or sit at a table at a parade or something, make phone calls maybe. But all of this work is important and needed, and there is a community for you out there. And when I have told people, those people who email me and say, will I have a future to grow up into? I go back to them and I say, yes, but you have to find your community. Find a group and show up even when you don't feel like it, even when it hurts your heart, just go. And then they come back to me and they say, I found this group, I did it, it helped. Thank you, right? Musk ox are protectors. I've mentioned this, they protect the vulnerable, they care about the youth. And so that means that as we think about the risks of climate change, we have to be really honest about who's facing those risks the most. Frontline communities, communities of color, Indigenous communities, and the youth who will bear the largest brunt of this crisis in the coming years. And that means not just sharing stories of climate wins, but also more cross-generational collaboration. I also would ask you, after you leave today, to stop fighting the generation wars. They are not healthy. Boomers, you gotta stop picking on Gen Z and the millennials. You have to do it. Gen Z and the millennials, you gotta stop picking on poor Gen X. They don't care anyway, so there's no point. You notice how I didn't say we anywhere in there. In 1980, I'm kind of like not really part of any generation. It's great. But I'm serious. There are people who worked in other movements in the past who have wisdom and knowledge to share about what works, whether that's in queer communities or in people who worked in the environmental movement or the civil rights movement. They have been doing this for a long time, and they know how to stay sustainable even in the face of feelings of hopelessness. They know what works. And there are youth who have a lot of energy and a lot of new skills to bring to the table. There are people from every generation, and we need to collaborate. And here's a really good example of that. We can be accomplices to each other in this work. A couple of years ago, so a year ago, as of this month, August, in a landmark case, a Montana judge ruled in favor of youth environmental activists who said that state agencies were violating their constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment by permitting the fossil fuel industry to develop without considering the effects on the climate. And that has since been upheld in the courts. And guess what? Maine is considered such a constitutional amendment. And for those of you who aren't from Maine, you could go back to your states and find a legislator who is helpful, because in the absence of strong federal leadership on climate in the coming years, there is so much we can do at the state and local level to move the needle. And once you can get your state constitution to enshrine your right to a clean and healthy environment in your constitution, you can sue the shit out of them for not doing that. It works. So to close, if you want to go out in the world and be a climate musk ox, you have to be loud like musk ox. Tell your climate story. We have a problem of climate silence in this country. Despite most Americans believing that climate change is a problem, most Americans don't talk about climate change in their day-to-day life. You don't need to know the facts. You don't need to know the whatever RCP something something. You don't have to have those numbers at your disposal. You just have to say, hey, remember how we used to go ice fishing in February and now the ice is too thin? I really wish I could take my grandkids ice fishing. Hey, remember when the lilacs did not bloom in April? Hey, it sure seems like all my grandkids have asthma. Even if we don't do something about climate change, maybe cleaning up the air is a good idea because, asthma is not great. Talk about your own lived experiences. Normalize talking about climate change at the school pickup line, at your, after church gatherings, etc. Be brave. This is where those of you who are in the creative fields, artists, visionaries, writers, poets, all of you, we cannot move towards something unless we know what we're moving towards. We can't just keep running away from, right? And so we need visionaries to imagine climate futures, right? I really wish Gene Roddenberry had told us how we got to the post-scarcity landscape of Star Trek. That would be really helpful, but it's nice to know that it's a possibility, right? So we have to imagine a better future so that we can fight for it. Be wise. You all have something to share. You have skills, you have experiences. We need you to share that wisdom. We need you to build coalitions of other people who could benefit from that wisdom. We need to be justice-centered. We have to fight for the most vulnerable before we have to fight for ourselves, so that we have those communities to lean on when the fires reach our houses. We have to be stubborn and reject the binary thinking that has dominated the climate discourse for decades, and practice active hope. Not the belief that someone will solve this for us, but the belief that we can solve this for ourselves. Rejecting the certainty of doomism is not denial of the reality of the climate crisis. It is an invitation to be a good ancestor. And I want to share something from an essay that I wrote in a collection that Rebecca Solnit put together called Not Too Late. What could we accomplish if we stood together and faced the danger? What seeds might we plant today that will one day take root above our bones? What if the future was better than the past? What if it was beautiful? And I invite you to sit with those questions and imagine those better futures. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you all have September 9th marked on your calendar for our last summer lecture series entitled Don't Fence Us In, New Ideas to Protect Acadia's Forests, featuring, among others, Scudic Institute's very own Chris Nadeau. So I hope you will all register and join us next month. And in the meantime, please join me in thanking Dr. Gill for this very insightful conversation.